There is a place on the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia where the desert meets the Gulf in a flat, industrial sprawl that produces more concentrated economic energy per square kilometer than almost anywhere else on the planet. The Ras Tanura complex, refinery, marine terminal, tank farm, loading piers, processes and exports a volume of crude oil that, if interrupted for 72 hours, would register as a measurable shock in every economy on Earth. It is not a secret facility. It appears on every commercial map. Its loading jetties extend into the Gulf in patterns visible from low-orbit satellites. Its storage tanks, arranged in concentric rows across the flat coastal plain, are large enough that the thermal signature of the crude oil they contain is detectable from altitude on an infrared sensor with modest resolution. It is also, by the standards of any serious military planner, almost impossible to fully defend. Not because the Saudis had not tried. The Prince Sultan Air Base Air Defense Network, the Patriot batteries positioned along the eastern province coastline, the radar coverage maintained by the Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces, these represented decades of investment and genuine capability. But Ras Tanura was not a point target. It was an area target, a complex that stretched across enough physical space that defending every critical node simultaneously required a density of interceptor coverage that no nation on Earth maintained in peacetime, and that even the United States, operating at full wartime posture in the Gulf, could not guarantee to a facility it did not directly control on sovereign Saudi territory. The Iranian planners understood this geometry precisely. By March 6, 2026, 8 days into Operation Epic Fury, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force had already lost a substantial fraction of its ballistic missile inventory to American airstrikes on launch infrastructure and to the intercept performance of Allied air defense networks across the Gulf. The exchange rate had been punishing. Every Shahed 3 that reached a terminal intercept solution had cost Tehran a platform and a crew. Every failed salvo had told American analysts something about the remaining inventory. The IRGC's senior planners were not unaware of this arithmetic. They were working inside it, adjusting, adapting, searching for the engagement geometry that would allow them to impose a cost that the Americans and their partners could not absorb without consequence. The Ras Tanura complex was not a military target. That was the point. At 11:22 p.m. on March 6th, the Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces Eastern Sector Radar Network registered the first contacts. A dense, low-altitude cluster of signals rising from 3 separate origination points along the Iranian coastline between Bandar Lenge and Levan Island. The signatures were small. Their radar cross-sections were consistent with the Shahed series loitering munition, a platform that had been used extensively throughout the conflict and whose approach profile, because of its slow speed and low altitude, presented an intercept geometry fundamentally different from the ballistic missiles that the PAC-3 batteries had been optimized to engage. The Patriot system was designed around the physics of a ballistic threat: high altitude, high speed, predictable trajectory, time-critical engagement. Drones were slow, low, numerous, and patient. They could be routed. They could loiter. They could approach from multiple vectors simultaneously and force an air defense network to solve many small problems at once, rather than one large one. There were 61 of them. The air defense duty officer at the Eastern Sector Command Post had been managing the Gulf air picture for 9 hours when the contacts appeared. He was running on 4 hours of sleep accumulated across the previous 2 days. His sector had intercepted 3 separate drone waves in the preceding 72 hours. Smaller packages, ranging from 8 to 22 platforms, that had been categorized in the post-engagement assessments as probing attacks. Real threats, but also calibration instruments. Each wave had told the IRGC something about response timing, about which nodes of the Saudi air defense network activated first, about the average interval between initial detection and the first interceptor launch. 61 simultaneous contacts at low altitude across a front of approximately 90 kilometers was not a probe. The duty officer transmitted the mass attack warning to CENTCOM at 11:23 p.m. and began coordinating the intercept assignment sequence with the 3 Patriot batteries in his sector and the 2 U.S. Navy surface combatants operating in the northern Gulf that had been allocated to his area of responsibility under the Joint Air Defense Coordination Agreement. The USS Carney had her SPY-1 radar already painting the incoming package. Her Aegis system had generated intercept solutions for the contacts in its engagement envelope within 40 seconds of initial detection. The Combat Information Center crew was at General Quarters. They had been at General Quarters in rotating shifts for 8 days. The displays showed a threat picture that the Air Warfare Coordinator described in the post-engagement debrief with the flat precision of someone who has learned to speak about extraordinary things in ordinary language. Complex, multi-axis, low altitude, saturating. The first SM-2 launched from the Carney at 11:24:17 p.m. The Combat Information Center aboard the Carney had the particular quality of a space that has been at combat stations long enough that its emergency configuration has become its normal configuration. The blue-white light of the threat displays cast the same shadows it had cast for 8 days. The smell in the CIC, recycled air, electronics running hot, the faint chemical trace of the fire suppression system that had been triggered briefly during a close-range drone engagement 4 days earlier and never fully cleared, had become so familiar that the crew no longer registered it consciously. The Air Warfare Coordinator stood at his console with the posture of someone who had long ago expended whatever physical reserve keeps the spine straight and was now being held upright by the momentum of the engagement itself, by the absolute necessity of the next decision and the one after that. He had 19 contacts in his engagement queue. He had interceptors for 14 of them before he would need to begin rationing. He started from the closest and worked outward. What followed over the next 22 minutes was the largest single air defense engagement in the Arabian Gulf since the beginning of the conflict. A run-in intercept sequence executed simultaneously by American shipboard systems, Saudi Patriot batteries, and Saudi short-range air defense units positioned on the Ras Tanura perimeter itself. The coordination between these systems was not seamless. It could not be seamless because the systems had been designed and procured by different nations across different decades, and their data links were not fully integrated at the tactical level. Information was being relayed by voice between the USS Carney's Combat Information Center and the Saudi Sector Command Post. Intercept assignments were being deconflicted in real time by officers speaking across a communications architecture that had been adequate for normal operations and was barely adequate for this one. There were gaps, 3-second windows between voice calls when a contact was neither assigned nor engaged, when two systems were both tracking the same drone and neither was firing because each was waiting for the other's deconfliction call. In 3 seconds, a Shahed series drone at cruise speed covers approximately 500 meters. The Saudi Patriot battery on the northern perimeter of the complex engaged its first contact at 11:24:44 p.m. The battery commander had an assignment queue of 11 contacts and was working through them in order of closest approach time. a rational prioritization that nonetheless meant that the contacts assigned later in the sequence were gaining distance on the target while the earlier engagements were being prosecuted. Air defense mathematics at saturation. There are only so many interceptors, they travel at a fixed speed and the targets do not wait. At 11:31 p.m., 8 minutes into the engagement, the duty officer at the Eastern Sector Command Post identified the critical problem. The 61 contacts had not been flying in a uniform formation. They had been flying in a dispersed, three-dimensional spread that had, over the preceding 9 minutes, gradually concentrated, the outer contacts slowing, the inner contacts accelerating, into a compression that was not random. It was deliberate. The drones were being herded by their guidance programming toward the same aim point from multiple axes simultaneously. A coordinated terminal compression designed to arrive at the perimeter of the Ras Tanura complex within a window of approximately 40 seconds. 40 seconds was not enough time for the Patriot battery on the northern perimeter to cycle through the remaining contacts in its queue. The Carney had expended 24 SM-2 interceptors and was reaching the point in her magazine where the air warfare coordinator had to begin rationing, choosing which contacts to engage with expensive interceptors and which to pass to shorter-range systems that might or might not have the geometry to reach them in time. 7 contacts broke through the outer intercept layer, the inner defense, the short-range Shahed systems on the Ras Tanura perimeter, engaged 4 of them. 2 were brought down by Saudi National Guard units on the tank farm perimeter using systems whose engagement ranges had not been designed for this approach speed and this aspect angle, but whose operators had the skill and the positioning to compensate for what the equipment could not provide on its own. A 3rd contact was intercepted at close range by a Patriot round that the battery commander fired on a near-minimum engagement geometry that the system's own software flagged as outside the optimal kill envelope. The intercept worked. The software, in this case, had been conservative. The 7th contact reached the Ras Tanura tank farm at 11:43 p.m. It had flown for 21 minutes from its launch point on the Iranian coastline, navigating at low altitude over the Gulf surface in a profile designed to stay below the engagement floor of the Patriot systems and inside the radar clutter generated by the wave action and the thermal inversion layer that forms over the Gulf at night in early March. Its guidance system had been updated, not in flight, but in design at the factory level, to account for the precise coordinates of the northeastern section of the Ras Tanura tank farm, a section that a satellite imagery analysis had identified as containing storage vessels whose geometric arrangement placed them in a coverage gap between the northern Patriot battery's engagement arc and the closest short-range air defense position on the perimeter's eastern edge. The gap was not large. It was large enough. The warhead detonated against the outer wall of Tank 17, one of the large crude storage vessels in the northeastern section of the farm. The explosive yield was not large. The fire that resulted was crude oil, once ignited at the surface of a ruptured storage vessel, does not behave like the fires that training exercises are built around. It behaves like a problem that is simultaneously chemical, structural, and thermal. A fire that intensifies as it consumes its own fuel, and that spreads not through the air, but through the ground, through the pipes and drainage channels that connect one storage vessel to the next, through the liquid pathways that the facility's own engineering had laid down for operational purposes, and that now served a different function entirely. The Saudi Aramco emergency response teams reached the tank farm at 11:47 p.m. They were professional and they were prepared. The facility maintained one of the most capable industrial fire response capabilities in the Gulf. because the facility's operators had always understood that the risk of catastrophic fire was the central operational hazard of what they were managing. The response teams worked through the night in heat that the team leader's post-incident report described as sufficient to make the standard proximity suits inadequate beyond 30 meters from the tank wall. They worked in rotating exposures, pulling back when the heat exceeded the safe threshold, advancing when it dropped, reading the fire's behavior with the attention of people whose expertise is fire and whose lives depend on that expertise being accurate. They did not allow the fire to spread to adjacent tanks. They contained it. By 3:15 a.m., the fire in Tank 17 had been brought under control, leaving a structure that was a total loss of asset but had not propagated its failure to the tank farm network. The Ras Tanura loading piers ceased operations at 11:45 p.m. and remained offline for 14 hours. 14 hours at Ras Tanura is not an abstraction. It is a specific quantity of crude oil that did not load onto tankers. It is a specific number of vessels that adjusted their arrival schedules. It is a specific movement in the futures market that happened before trading opened in London, and had already rippled into the opening prices in New York by the time the piers resumed operations. The Iranian planners had not needed to destroy Ras Tanura to achieve their strategic objective. They had needed only to touch it, to demonstrate that the facility that the global economy treated as a fixed, permanent, invulnerable feature of the energy landscape could be reached, could be interrupted, could be made to stop for 14 hours by 61 small aircraft and one warhead that found its target. The Carney had expended 31 SM-2 interceptors and 4 SM-6 rounds. Her forward VLS cells were at 43% capacity. The Air Defense Coordinator filed a munitions status report at midnight that noted, without editorial, that the ship's ability to sustain another engagement of equivalent scale within the following 24 hours would be constrained by the available interceptor inventory. The report recommended expedited resupply. The resupply was authorized. The logistics chain to move the interceptors from the nearest available storage facility to the Carney's position in the northern Gulf would take 31 hours. In those 31 hours, the ship was still on station. She was still defending. She was doing it with what remained in her cells. The post-engagement assessment of the Ras Tanura attack required 4 days to complete, because the attack had been complex enough that the reconstruction of the engagement geometry, the precise flight paths of all 61 contacts, the intercept assignments, the coverage gaps that had allowed 7 contacts to penetrate the outer layer, required a level of data integration across Saudi, American, and Allied systems that the Joint Assessment Team worked through methodically and without shortcuts. The final report ran to 47 pages. Its executive summary contained 3 conclusions. The first was that the engagement had demonstrated, for the first time in this conflict, that the IRGC Aerospace Force had the operational capability to plan and execute a coordinated drone saturation attack of sufficient scale to challenge the combined Saudi-American air defense architecture in the eastern province. The capability had existed before. The willingness to use it against a civilian energy facility had been debated in the strategic literature for years. On March 6, 2026, it was no longer theoretical. The second conclusion was that the air defense performance, 38 contacts intercepted before reaching the Ras Tanura perimeter, 4 more intercepted inside the perimeter, 2 brought down by ground forces on the tank farm itself, represented an effective rate that, by any historical standard, was exceptional. 54 of 61 contacts neutralized. In any other context, that would be a success so complete as to require no further analysis. In this context, the one contact that was not neutralized had reached a tank farm at the center of the global energy economy. The math of near perfection is unforgiving when the target is irreplaceable. The third conclusion was about what came next. The IRGC had demonstrated the concept. They had the platforms. They had the guidance systems. They had shown, with 61 drones and one successful impact, that the eastern province of Saudi Arabia was not beyond reach, and that the infrastructure sitting on its coastline was not beyond harm. Whether the next attempt would be larger or different, or routed through an approach vector that the current defense geometry did not fully cover. That was the question that the assessment team could not answer, because the answer was inside the planning cells of an adversary that had spent 8 days learning from its engagements and had just received the most detailed feedback it had ever obtained about the coverage architecture it was trying to defeat. Tank 17 was a total loss. The loading piers operated again. The crude oil moved, but something had changed in the eastern province that night. A certainty had been qualified. An assumption had been made conditional, and the people responsible for the security of the most economically significant square kilometers on the surface of the Earth were now working with a modified understanding of what their defenses could guarantee and what they could only attempt. The fire at Tank 17 burned for 3 hours and 19 minutes. The light it produced was visible from the open Gulf, a column of orange against the flat black of the coastal plain, reflected in the water, seen by the crews of vessels holding position outside the strait and waiting to learn whether the world's oil supply would flow or stop. It flowed. But the light was still visible when the sun rose, and the men who had watched it from the water understood that what they had seen was not the end of something. It was the proof of a concept that no one in the Gulf would be permitted to forget. The ocean does not care what burns on its coastline, but the men who sail it remember every fire, because the next one will come from a direction the last one taught the enemy to avoid.